Especially if there's a new beekeeper. I went to one swarm yesterday. The new beekeeper's all dressed up like Jimmy is now. I'm in t-shirt and shorts. It's a swarm. And I promise you swarms don't sting, because all swarms are interested in is keeping together and sending people out to look for a new home. So swarms are the gentlest kinds of bees, usually. But then you find the one that stings the heck out of you, and you go back, as Jimmy says, and dress up, or you wait till tomorrow. Okay, bees. How many kinds of bees in a hive? 1, 2, 3, 4?
3.
3, correct. And who's the boss?
The queen.
The queen. There is one queen bee in every hive, and only one. And that's like your home, you know, where there's one queen that orders everybody around. And then there's a lot of, what are the most of the bees in the hive? Do we know?
Workers.
Workers, right. Most of the hive is worker bees, and they're all girls. All the work in the hive is done by girls, and that's as life should be. I hear no protesting. And essentially, the worker bees do all the work of the hive. The queen does two things. The queen lays eggs, and she also gives off a scent called a pheromone. And the reason for the pheromone is that the bees want to know when they're in the colony that there is a queen there, that she's alive and well and she's doing her job, and that's how she tells them. We'll talk about it in a minute, but when the pheromone starts wearing off and the bees find out the queen isn't doing her job, then they will find a new queen. We'll talk about that in a bit. But the workers, they live for about 41 days, so just a little over a month and a half. And they start by looking after the queen. The queen cannot feed herself and she can't groom herself, so the bees do that for her. Other bees will be taking garbage out of the hive, dead bees or little bits of plant or whatever that they don't want. And still other bees will be feeding the babies, basically, or capping the pupa, which we'll talk about in a moment, or they'll be reducing the content of water in the honey until it's 16% and then capping off the honey. So the worker bees do an awful lot of jobs. The final job they do in their lives is to go out and forage, which means they go out and search for pollen and nectar. And what do you think happens when they've finished foraging? One day they can't fly back to the hive, and that's the end of their life. So the poor worker bees, the girls, work very, very hard, 24/7, and for about 41 days. Now there's a third type of bee in the hive.
The drone.
The drone. And the drone are the boys. And what do you think the boys do? Well, they sit on the porch here, and they watch the clouds go by, and they smell the flowers, and they really don't do very much. And that's how it should be, right? Until winter comes. What do you think happens then? All the little girls say, we're not going to feed these boys through the winter. We've got enough job keeping warm and keeping fed ourselves. So around about October, November, they throw all the drones out of the hive. And that's the end of the drones. So the boys have a good summer, let's put it that way. So we keep all these bees in a hive. And Jimmy was showing you the hive tool. There are a number of products that the bee makes. The bee has to make wax from its wax glands to build comb. It has to be able to store pollen and honey so they can bring it back to the hive, but it also picks up resins or glues from plants, and the bee will stick everything together that it can. Everywhere there's daylight, everywhere there's two pieces of wood together, they will glue it. So the first job of the hive tool is to take the lid off the hive, and trust me, it's often stuck. This one isn't. We put a bit of smoke in. Why do we do that? To calm the bees down? Well, you see what happens is they'll smell the smoke. They'll say to themselves, there's a fire somewhere. And so they'll go and gorge on honey because they may have to move out. And while they're gorging on honey, they're not stinging me. So that's a good thing. So we take the top off. Now, bees in nature are living in hollow trees, underneath houses. Generally, they will build a hive wherever they can find a dark space that's big enough. Beekeepers want to manage their hives so that we can get honey. Some people also collect the propolis, the glue, and some people collect the beeswax. And we can't do that if they're in the middle of a tree somewhere. You can't go chopping the tree down every time you want to collect honey, right? So we put these frames into a box. This was a gentleman called Mr. Langstroth invented this. We know a couple of things, but we know a lot about bees. there's a thing called bee space. The bees need 3/4 of an inch bee space in order to get around the hive. So these are designed that by the time they've built comb out, there is 3/4 of an inch left for them to walk around between the frames. It's also such that once the bees have built this out, this is a foundation. They build their comb out from here, from wax. So when we pull these out, usually there's a lot of comb there. There will be eggs and brood and honey on these frames. And Josiah will show you honeycomb in a minute. And this makes the hive easy to manage. And when we put boxes on top and they put their honey stores there, we can take the boxes off and get the honey. It also allows us to pull out the frames in the box where they live and make sure there are eggs and brood and a queen who's doing her job properly. Because if the queen's not there, we have a problem. Unless the bees have laid eggs. Now, I have some pictures because I'm sure you've never seen a honeybee up close, have you? This is a close-up picture of a honeybee. And you'll see. What do you think? What strikes you most? She looks just like the regular worker bees, but she has a longer abdomen. That's the yellow part of her body. Reason is because she's got lots of eggs in there and she's laying eggs all day. And she pokes that abdomen down into the honeycomb and lays an egg. And that's a queen. And if you're a beekeeper, you want to find the queen because you want to see that the hive's healthy. Like that, she's very hard to find because she's just slightly bigger than all the other bees. So what we do, if we can remember to do it, is we put paint on the head of the bee. It's on what's called the thorax. It would just be like painting the top of your head. And I think if you looked at the observation hive out there, you saw a bee with white paint. This year we put red paint on. There's a sequence of colours so that we know how old the queen is. This year is red, last year was yellow, the year before was white. Most beekeepers will change their queens after a couple of years because you want them to be productive. As I said, the bees may decide that for you. Eggs. And eggs are little white specks like this in the bottom of the honeycomb. Very hard for old people like me to see, so you hold the frame up with the sun behind you looking down into the comb and you hope you can see these little white specks. 3 or 4 days after the white specks, they've grown into these little maggoty things that we call pupa, and those gain between 6 and 10 times their body weight every day until they fill the honeycomb. At which point the bees put a wax cap on the top and they go through a process called metamorphosis, which your mothers will explain to you when you get home. Essentially, it's a process by which they change physically from this kind of being into a honeybee with wings, eyes, legs, and everything else that a honeybee has. And when they've achieved that, they eat through the wax that's holding them in their cell and they go out and join the hive. When the bees decide that they don't like their mum anymore because she's gotten weak and ineffective, they will produce a new queen. And the way they do that is they lay eggs just as if it was a regular bee, but then they feed it on a very rich diet called royal jelly. And they'll probably lay 4 or 5 queen cells. And they're much bigger. They look like a little piece of peanut, and they're much bigger than the regular cells. They hang out on the sides of the frames. And when the first one of these hatches, what happens? You have a queen, and she goes and kills the old queen, and then she kills all the other queen cells, because we only have 1 queen in the hive. So whoever gets born first is the queen. If you don't put the bees in a hive like this, they build comb a bit like you see here. And some people believe in foundationless hives where you just put a top board in the hive, and then they will build comb in this shape. And then you'll see the bee space, the 3/4 of an inch they leave behind each layer. The only problem with this is if you're managing the hive to get honey or to get anything else that the bees make, this is very difficult to manage because the bees will build across from one to the other and build something called cross comb, which means you'll pull a frame out and the whole thing will break apart. Or they will build burr comb, which means they build comb almost anywhere if they're producing a lot of wax. So we like to do it like this to confine where they grow it. Some people prefer this, but if you're doing it without the foundation, you can't pick up the frame and do this because it breaks off. So you have to pick out the frames and you can only look at it that way. Most of us like to be able to move the frame around without breaking all the honeycomb. A package is where you get basically a swarm. You get a lot of bees and a new queen that they don't know in a box, and you install it in a hive. That's a half-hour presentation. Or you buy a nuke, where some commercial beekeepers will put 5 frames in a small box, and you will buy it with bees and brood and eggs and everything, so you're ahead of the game. But you do all that in March and April. And so what we say to people is, come to the club, learn about bees for 6 months, and then get your bees. Oh, bees also need a water source, if I didn't tell you that. Hive is at 95 degrees, summer and winter. So in the winter, they curl up into a big basketball shape with the queen in the center, and they shiver to keep warm. And as they get cold on the outside, they move to the middle, and the middle bees move to the outside. It's called a cluster. That way they keep the queen warm. In the summer, when it gets above 95, they go get water and they fan like crazy their wings at the front of the hive to get a flow through there. Fascinating critters.
How much does it take to make like an 8-ounce jar of honey?
One bee will produce 1/12 of a tablespoon of honey in its lifetime.
1/12 of a teaspoon. It's about a drop. Even smaller.
I hate honey queens, they know everything.
I don't know everything.
I'm sorry, I love
know
honey. I actually love honey queens, but sorry, yes, 1/12 of a teaspoon a single bee will make. You can get probably 5 gallons of honey off of a hive.
Oh, at least.
Well, if you get 10, I'm moving my hives to your property. You get at least a bucket full of honey.
How often are you harvesting for honey? For
In the old days, they did it twice a year because they had a spring flow and a winter flow, a fall flow. Nowadays, you only get the spring flow, so once a year. Fall honey is not particularly tasty. Fall honey comes from, what's that yellow flower?
Snow on the
Mesquite. No, mesquite.
mesquite's blooming now, but the snow on the mountain or snow on the prairie is kind of
Anyway,
yellow.
fall honey doesn't taste great, so leave it for the bees, unless it's buckwheat honey. Now, if you can get buckwheat honey, buy some, because whenever your children get sore throats, buckwheat honey is better than Robitussin. Now, it doesn't taste good,